Members of the barrio, today we'll compare life in New York City to the surrounding suburbs from somebody who's lived in both places. Me, you don't want to miss this. Let's start with a definition of suburb. It's usually deployed to describe residential communities outside central urban areas. As New York is the largest city in the country, we also have the most outlying suburban areas. Central and northern New Jersey, Westchester County, New York, the Hudson Valley, even parts of Connecticut, Long Island. That is a lot of people, and there's a reason they call it the tri-state area. Things get even murkier if we start to include the areas that border Long Island and Queens, or let's say Riverdale in the Bronx, which basically look like suburbs, but we're not even gonna get into that. I spent most of my life living in Fair Lawn, New Jersey, a sleepy commuter town about 20 minutes from the George Washington Bridge in Manhattan. Did anyone else's parents put plastic on the couch too? I'm just curious. Housing. This is one of the biggest differences between life in New York City and the suburbs. Approximately 2 million of the 3.5 million residences in New York City are rented. That means about 2/3 of New Yorkers rent their homes. And that's the starkest difference in my opinion, is that most people who live in the surrounding areas are homeowners. I know lately that the cost of buying a home in the suburbs has skyrocketed, but you still get way more for your money as far as space is concerned in the suburbs than you'd ever get in New York City. The median resale price for a Manhattan apartment in the second quarter of 2021 hit just under $1 million. Many people's only chance of ever being a homeowner is to leave the city. As far as housing costs are concerned in the city, it's more about how safe is your neighborhood, how trendy is it, how many bars and restaurants are there, how connected is it to the subway. The size of apartments in New York City isn't necessarily going to be the biggest factor to how expensive it is. I know this because I spent 9 years in the Village, and the average apartment there is tiny and very expensive. And in the suburbs, we're looking at different factors, like how good the school system is. And on the whole, suburbs tend to have better public schools than New York City does. Another factor for a suburban community is how far away is it from New York City? Does it have direct train line access? Even within a town, being closer to the train station is going to make that house a lot more valuable. And then of course, we look at space, because in the suburbs, the size of your house does matter a lot. You're paying more for a bigger house. Pretty simple. Maintenance. I have friends who are new homeowners, and they have complained to me about sneaky little maintenance costs that they never thought about before they actually own their own spot. Now compare that to me in Brooklyn right now, and just last week my stove wasn't working really well. I got the owner on the phone within 10 minutes and we were working through how we were gonna fix it, got a repair guy to come. I didn't spend a penny on that, because when you're renting a spot, almost all the maintenance issues are the responsibility of the landlord. So you have a lot less things to worry about. And you also have a lot less space to worry about. When you own a home, you've got to maintain that backyard, you've got to mow the front lawn, or you've got to pay a landscaper to do so. So there's extra responsibilities with being a homeowner in the suburbs. Traditionally speaking, families tend to prefer the suburbs, and the logic is single people meet in the city, get married, have kids, and then move away. Now, it doesn't always work like that. You have more space. Where I grew up in New Jersey, I could go to the backyard and have a catch with my twin brother. Being a parent in the city, you constantly have to supervise your kids, especially the smaller ones. You can't just let them run to the backyard. You've got to accompany them to a park, for example. In New York, your space is public. In the suburbs, your space is private. You get a lot less noise as well. Where I grew up in Jersey, I think the loudest thing I would ever hear after midnight would be a car alarm going off. In New York City, don't get me started. You're not gonna have those annoying neighbors running up and down the stairs at all hours of the night. Although then again, you can have kids for that. But as someone who doesn't have kids, I don't know all of the unique challenges that you would face living in New York City. So for some of those parents watching, tell me in the comments what those challenges are, because I'm curious. Now, there is a cost of living difference between the suburbs and the city, And you'll see it most drastically in restaurants and bars because they pay higher rent. As far as supermarkets are concerned, I don't think the differences are as high as you would expect. We just did a video about the cost of living in New York City, and if you're curious what I pay for a lot of my everyday expenses, go check that out. Crime. Crime rates are higher in big cities. That is simply an undeniable fact. If you want to live in an area with a lower crime rate, you should move to the suburbs. And for all of my complaints about growing up in the suburbs of New Jersey, my biggest fear as a kid walking around by myself was, I don't know, getting hit by a car. Things that people wouldn't bat an eyelid at in New York City would get the police called in a suburb. For example, the other day, I saw out my window, a guy was walking down the middle of the street, talking loudly to himself. He looked very mentally unstable. I don't think anybody called the cops here. If that same guy did that where I grew up, there probably would have been 5 police calls made within a few minutes. And it's also about noise, littering, small quality of life things. You just get used to it. Cars. This is the classic suburb versus city debate, although we can also make it a Los Angeles versus New York City debate. Almost every single person I know who lives in a suburb has a car. Normally multiple cars. In fact, I've seen it where every single person in one household has their own car. This is what I miss least about living in suburban New Jersey, was having to rely on my car for almost everything. The most desirable parts of New York City are that way because of their walkability. In my case, within 3 minutes, I can walk to the subway. I can walk to my gym. I can walk to the nearest deli. In fact, I can walk to 2 or 3 delis. I can walk to 10 restaurants very close to where I live. Where I lived in New Jersey, to go to the gym was about a 15 or 20-minute drive. The grocery store was about a 10-minute drive. To get to 10 restaurants, I don't even know how long it would have taken to do that. On the flip side, you're also exposed to the elements living in New York City without a car. To brutal cold and wind, to the heat and the humidity. Living in New Jersey, I could just hop in my climate-controlled automobile, put on the air conditioner, put on the heating, go park somewhere, and be exposed outside for a maximum of the time it would take me to walk through a parking lot. The weather is absolutely a bigger factor in New York City when you're walking everywhere. I am curious though, for my suburban viewers out there, what's it been like not commuting as much? Do you enjoy it more? And do you want to get back to your office in New York City? Diversity. I don't know how it is today, but where I grew up in New Jersey, most of the kids in my school more or less looked like me. My town was very Jewish and Italian. There's no question that if you live in New York City, you will be exposed to a lot more diversity. And it's not just skin color, but it's also origin. New York City has people here from every country in the world, as well as all 50 states. Hands down, you will get a lot more culture in New York City and things to do. One of the things I miss least about living in suburban New Jersey was all the retail chains. That is something you are constantly exposed to, are big retail outlets. In New York City, there are so many small, locally owned businesses. And while suburban New Jersey has plenty of amazing Italian food, pizza, and bagels, New York City's culinary scene absolutely blows it away. Although, a quick aside, I have never had a better bagel in New York City than the bagels I had growing up in New Jersey, and I'm gonna prove it to you all in an upcoming video. Stay tuned. Now, comparing New York City's vast culinary scene to the surrounding suburbs, it's just not fair to do so, and if you followed my channel, we have explored in depth the tons of different places and countries that you can eat from in this great city. It's also the amount of live music venues here, the amount of culture the city has with its museums and other attractions. There's also always something new here. The rent is so high that a lot of businesses don't survive. Now, it's a pro of New York City and it's a con of New York City because a lot of your favorite businesses won't be there 10 years from now. If you live in an area with a lot of chains, odds are those corporations won't have a problem keeping them afloat for the long run. New York City is also one of the world's biggest tourist destination, so there is no shortage of attractions for your children. And if you're an adult, there's no shortage of nightlife that runs very late, or should I say very early into the morning hours. And if you're single, there's way more options for dating, there's way more single people, and there's way more diversity within that dating pool. Heck, my friend the other day met a girl off of Tinder from South Sudan, not South Brunswick. I'm not saying one is better than the other, because even if you live in a suburb of New York City, you are still in proximity to the greatest city on earth. My question for you all out there is, what do you prefer? And I'm really curious about those who left New York City to a surrounding suburb. Do you regret the decision? Why or why not? I want to see all of your comments down below. Guys, thank you so much for watching. As always, till next time.